All right, welcome back from the names example. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about methods some more. It's important to know that what we've been doing so far is to use methods. We've taken objects and called methods from them, like string objects. We've called their length method or their substring method or other methods. But we also sometimes write our own methods. And we do that when we have a task that's unique, that a pre-existing method doesn't already solve. And in that case, we need to create our own method. And sometimes we'll do that when we write new versions of built-in methods. So there are some certain methods that we're going to look at that happen at certain times in programs, like when the program starts, or every time the window is repainted, or when a mouse is clicked. And sometimes we'll write versions of those methods. Other times we'll write special purpose methods that really aren't already associated with processing, and we'll see some examples of that in Chapter 6. Okay, so let's talk about writing methods. Conceptually, we talked about the idea of a black box and how a method was a black box, and we didn't care about the details inside. Well, when we're writing a method, now we do care about the details inside. We're providing the details that are inside of that black box. That's the whole point. So as a programmer, you have to work on both sides of that divide. Sometimes you use methods and you don't really care how they work, but sometimes you write methods, in which case you do care because you have to say how they work. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and move on and look at some of the methods that we're going to be using and creating, and these will be built-in methods. Okay? And when I say built-in, what I mean is these are methods that are already associated with processing and certain events that happen in processing. So the first one that we'll look at is the setup method. And the event that setup is associated with is when the program starts. So when the program first starts, when you execute a program by clicking the play button on the processing development environment, the setup method is the first thing that happens. And then it never gets called again. What it's used for is housekeeping tasks, so to speak. Things that you need to have done before the rest of the program can run. Stuff like sizing the display window. So your size method is almost always going to be in setup when I write methods. Or loading images, sounds, and fonts. So creating pictures that I can put in, or sounds, or later on in Chapter 4 we'll be talking about typography, and we'll use fonts. Well, loading those would be done in setup. Or setting global graphics features. Like if I want to turn off the outline on shapes, for instance, I would do no stroke in setup. Okay? So here's how setup will look when we write it. Every method that we write has got a first line right here. It's called the signature of the method. That tells us three things about the method. First of all, it tells us the name. So in this case, setup is the name. Secondly, it tells us what the method takes as parameters, and that would be in these parentheses. In this case, setup doesn't take any parameters, so there's nothing in between the parentheses. And the last thing it shows us is what it returns. And if we see void, that means it doesn't return anything. Okay? So setup is just a black box that doesn't take any information in, doesn't send any information out. After the signature, we're going to have a pair of curly brackets that define the body of that method. Okay? One here and one here. A good top tip for writing methods is when I write the signature, I'll write my starting curly bracket and then my ending curly bracket right away, and then come back and fill in the details later. That way you'll never miss a bracket. Also, it's good practice to label your ending brackets with a comment that tells where they belong to. Okay? So I know that this bracket is the end of the setup method. And all the stuff that we would write about setup would go in the middle. Okay? Things like the size method, loading fonts, loading images or sounds, all of that would go inside setup. And we'll see some examples later when we look at further programming. Okay, moving right along then. Another method that we'll use, and if we write a setup, we'll have to write this next method, is the draw method. Okay, and this is what's actually responsible for drawing the contents of the display window. So every time the display window is redrawn, that method is called. And that happens, on the order of 60 times per second. FPS means frames per second, depending on the hardware and the complexity of what it is that you're drawing. Okay, so it happens a lot. But every time the screen needs to be repainted, the draw method is what's called. So we can use this in two ways. We can use this for static images, and that would be if the draw method is called the same way every time. Or if somehow the draw method changes, then what we see in the display window will be animated. Okay? And so in that case, you would vary what you're drawing slightly every time, and that way it would appear to move. So it's sort of like an old flip book where you would draw one frame of the image on each page of the book, and then as you flip through those pages, the thing appears to move. Okay? Syntax for the draw method looks very similar to what we had with setup. We have our signature, which tells us that the name of the method is draw, that it doesn't take any parameters, and that it does not have any return values. Opening and closing curly brackets, labeled with a comment, and whatever we want to be in the draw method, that is what we want to draw the actual scene, goes inside the method body. Okay? All right, another one. So setup happens at the beginning and then never again. Draw happens 60 times a second or so as the draw method is executed. The mouse click method, on the other hand, is only called when the user clicks a mouse button over the display window. Okay, and it works with any of the mouse buttons. So it doesn't matter if you have a Mac that has one mouse button, or a PC that's got two, or a Linux box that's got three. When any of those buttons is clicked with the mouse pointer over the display window, the mouse click method is called. And so this is obviously used to handle user input. When they click on the mouse, this is what I want the program to do. Okay? Syntax-wise, again, very similar. The signature says that the name of the method is mouse clicked. Notice that it's got a capital C for the second word in mouse clicked. No parameters, return type void, and my curly brackets, comments, and the guts of mouse click would go in here. Okay? Now it turns out that there are a bunch of these built-in methods for key presses, mouse movement, all kinds of different things. And where you would go to find out about them would be to the processing reference page, processing.org-reference. Okay? So you should do that whenever you have questions so that you can understand what's going on. Okay, so let's give yourself a little test here. I want you to write two different versions of a processing program. The first one should display a processing program, or a processing programmer that should display a colored square, and that should just be a filled red square centered in the display window. And then the second program that you write should do the same thing to begin with, but it should change that square to blue when a mouse button is clicked. Okay? So you should go off and think about that. Try to get that to work. And then we'll come back and we'll pick up and talk about creating objects. Okay, I hope you were able to successfully complete that little test there. It's really not too difficult, but if you have any questions, make sure that you ask. All right, we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about objects at this point and the special methods that are involved in creating them. Then after a break, we'll talk about images and sounds in processing. Okay, so to set this up, let's go back to our analogy. Classes are blueprints. Objects are the things built from those blueprints. So if you have blueprints for a house, how do you make a house based on those plans? There has to be something in the middle that translates the blueprint into the house. Well, you do that by following the plans. You either do it yourself or you hire somebody else to do it for you. Okay? And it's kind of like that in programming. We either have to write a special method that builds the objects ourselves, or we hire or ask someone else some other method to do it for us that's already created. So, when we create objects ourselves, we have to use a special keyword called new, along with a call to a special method for the class called the constructor. Okay? And here's how you would do that in the case of a string. And now obviously this is sort of the hard way to do it. Processing lets us make shortcuts, but nonetheless, we're still making a string named S. We say that we're going to make a new object by using the new keyword, and then we call the constructor for the string class. Notice that the constructor is exactly the same name as the class itself, but I pass in a parameter, in this case, which tells me, or tells the string object, what its content should be. Okay? So after that method has been completed, S will be a string reference variable pointing to the characters Roger. Okay? So we use the new keyword and a constructor. And we'll be talking more about those as we go. The second way is sometimes we can call a method that returns objects. Okay? And so someplace inside their black box of code, they do that construction for us and send it back. And one example of that is when we get user input via a dialog box. So we have joptionpane.showInputDialog. That brings up the message box. Okay, and once the user enters something in there and clicks OK, the code inside that showInputDialog method creates the string and returns it so that we can assign it to this variable S. Okay? So that's the two ways basically that we create objects. We either have to do it ourselves by invoking the new keyword and using the constructor, or by calling some other method that does all that for us and returns the object. Well, and how do we know about things like that? Again, we look at the reference pages. For strings, you'd look at the Java language reference pages to find out what are the constructors for strings. What is the, on the JOption pane would also be there. What does its showInputDialog method return, and so on. Okay, so you, based on your experience and your research onto those pages, you learn more about objects and you know whether you have to do them via new or calling a method or something else. Okay, so that's more about methods and constructing objects with them. And in our next video, we're going to go ahead and start doing images and sounds.